So there I was in court with a smug HOA rep claiming I'd illegally planted trees on my own land. The courtroom was stifling with tension, the air thick with anticipation. As the judge leaned forward, his eyes locked on me, he asked in a calm, measured tone, "Is it true, sir, that this trench was altered?" My heart pounded in my chest as I met his gaze. I had spent months fighting for the legal recognition of my land's wetlands, a declaration that, I knew, would send shockwaves through the very foundation of the HOA's authority. In that charged moment, the truth was laid bare. I was not the lawbreaker they assumed me to be. I was the property owner, and I had every right to cultivate nature on my own terms. What followed was a courtroom drama that would soon reverberate far beyond those walls, turning the tables on an HOA that had long overstepped its bounds. Cedar Grove Estates was supposed to be a model of suburban perfection, a gated community where every lawn was a work of art, every tree meticulously pruned, and every deviation from the uniform landscape was met with immediate correction. For decades, the local homeowners association, HOA, had maintained that order, dictating everything from the type of shrubs allowed to the exact placement of decorative features. The rules were rigorous, and the board enforced them with an iron fist. It was an environment where individuality was sacrificed at the altar of conformity. At the helm of that rigid regime was Karen Miller, the self-appointed enforcer who had become infamous in Cedar Grove. Dressed in tailored suits, her eyes always alert behind a pair of oversized glasses, Karen prided herself on her unwavering commitment to the rules. She patrolled the neighborhood like a hawk, snapping photos and filing complaints at the drop of a hat. To her, every tree not pruned to perfection and every garden ornament out of line was a personal affront, one that demanded retribution. I, on the other hand, was a longtime resident and a man who cherished the natural world. Inheriting a sizable tract of land on the outskirts of Cedar Grove, I had built my life around a simple philosophy. Nature, in all its untamed beauty, was meant to be celebrated, not suppressed. My property wasn't a sterile, uniform lot. It was a living tapestry of wild meadows, gently winding streams, and, most importantly, wetlands that I had nurtured and legally declared as a protected natural habitat. Over the years, I had labored to restore and maintain these wetlands, knowing that they not only enhanced the ecological value of my property, but also served as a critical buffer against the relentless march of suburban development. I had even invested time and money into a comprehensive wetland declaration, a legal document that formally recognized the ecological importance of the marshy areas on my land. This declaration was not only an expression of my commitment to conservation, but also a shield against the heavy-handed tactics of the HOA. Yet the very thing I had fought so hard to preserve became a flashpoint. Karen, obsessed with maintaining a pristine, manicured image for Cedar Grove, had taken issue with my naturalistic approach. She viewed my wetlands as a blight, a deviation from the picture-perfect ideal that she enforced. Determined to fix what she saw as an imperfection, she began targeting my property with fines and complaints, accusing me of illegal modifications and unauthorized landscaping. The tension between my commitment to nature and the HOA's demand for uniformity had been building for years. My wetland declaration was my proudest achievement, a testament to the power of preserving natural ecosystems amid a sea of conformity. And now, Karen's latest complaint would force me into a courtroom, where I would have to defend not only my right to nurture the land, but also the very idea that nature should be allowed to flourish without bureaucratic interference. The conflict came to a head when Karen Miller, determined to restore order to Cedar Grove, filed a new complaint against me. According to her, my wetland declaration was not only a violation of community standards, but also an illegal alteration of my property. She argued that by designating a large swath of my land as a protected wetland, I had disrupted the orderly aesthetic mandated by the HOA. Her complaint was precise in its language, laden with legal jargon that threatened fines, penalties, and even the forced removal of what she called unauthorized natural features. I was stunned. I had followed every legal protocol in drafting and submitting my wetland declaration. Environmental experts had validated its significance, and local authorities had acknowledged its importance for biodiversity and flood control. Yet, in Karen's eyes, it was an act of rebellion, a direct challenge to the meticulously manicured order of Cedar Grove. Immediately, I gathered my documentation, the original wetland declaration, expert reports, and correspondence with local environmental agencies. I also combed through the HOA records, noting a long history of Karen's petty fines and arbitrary complaints against residents who dared to deviate from her vision of perfection. It wasn't just about my wetlands. It was about a pattern of behavior that stifled individuality and innovation in our community. I filed my own countercomplaint, arguing that my wetlands were a legally protected natural resource, and that any attempt to penalize me for preserving an ecosystem was not only baseless, but unconstitutional. The paperwork was tedious, but I was resolute. Every document, every expert opinion, was a brick in the fortress of my defense. I knew I had the law on my side, but I also knew that Karen's influence ran deep within the HOA. Many board members had long tolerated her strict enforcement, even when it bordered on absurdity. I feared that the initial hearings might be stacked against me. In the days leading up to the court date, tensions in Cedar Grove grew palpable. Neighbors, many of whom had been quietly suffering under the weight of Karen's fines, began to rally behind me. Conversations in community forums, text messages exchanged over coffee breaks at local diners, and even whispered discussions in the hallways of our apartment complexes revealed a growing discontent with the HOA's heavy-handed policies. "It's time someone stood up for our right to live naturally," one resident texted. "We shouldn't have to choose between a pristine lawn and the beauty of nature," another commented online. I received support from unexpected quarters, too. Local environmental activists and legal experts who specialized in property rights began weighing in on my case. Their endorsements bolstered my confidence, and I started organizing a digital campaign to spread awareness about the importance of preserving natural landscapes, even if they didn't conform to the HOA's vision of perfection. Hashtags like #WetlandWarrior and #NatureOverNonsense started trending, and soon my case became a rallying point for others who had been victimized by arbitrary enforcement. As the court date loomed, I prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I met with my lawyer to review every detail of the wetland declaration, ensuring that my arguments were watertight. We rehearsed responses to potential questions from the judge, and I gathered testimonials from environmental experts who could speak to the ecological benefits of my property. My determination was unshakable. I was ready to defend my right to preserve nature, regardless of the personal vendetta being waged by an overzealous HOA rep. The tension reached a fever pitch when the day of the hearing finally arrived. I walked into the courtroom with a calm confidence, bolstered by the support of my community and the strength of the legal foundation underpinning my wetlands. In that moment, I knew that this wasn't just my fight. It was a stand for every resident who had ever been bullied into conformity. The battle lines were drawn, and the outcome would determine not only my future, but the future of individuality in Cedar Grove. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. As the proceedings began, the judge called the case to order, and the room fell silent. Karen Miller, representing the HOA, sat with a smug expression that suggested she was certain of her victory. Her attorney presented a case laden with citations from the HOA's restrictive guidelines, arguing that any deviation from the approved landscaping, even a legally declared wetland, was a violation of community standards. They painted my wetlands as an unauthorized alteration that disrupted the visual harmony of Cedar Grove, citing penalties and fines that were meant to deter such innovative landscaping. I listened, my heart pounding, as the opposing counsel made their case. But when it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my voice steady and resolute. I began by explaining the origins of my wetland declaration, a labor of love born from a deep respect for the land and a commitment to ecological balance. I recounted how I had consulted with environmental experts, conducted soil tests, and even collaborated with local conservation agencies to draft a document that was not only legally sound, but also ecologically vital. My tone was measured yet impassioned as I declared, "This is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of preservation." I showed the judge the documentation, expert reports, and even letters of support from local environmental groups. The courtroom was rapt as I laid out my arguments. I demonstrated that my wetlands provided critical benefits. They reduced flood risk, improved water quality, and supported local biodiversity. I argued that these natural features were protected under state environmental laws, and that any attempt to fine me for preserving them was not only unjust, but a violation of my property rights. I pointed out that while the HOA had the power to enforce certain aesthetic standards, that power did not extend to infringing on federally and state-protected natural resources. As my presentation unfolded, the judge's expression shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. The evidence was overwhelming, and the legal precedents were clear. However, Karen's attorney tried to pivot the discussion, arguing that my actions had set a dangerous precedent for the community, a precedent that could lead to unruly, unregulated changes across all properties. Their argument was that if one homeowner could declare wetlands at will, then the carefully curated aesthetics of Cedar Grove would be thrown into chaos. At that moment, a murmur ran through the courtroom. I could sense the tension, the uncertainty, and the hope in the eyes of the residents who had gathered to witness the case. Outside the courthouse, news cameras captured whispered conversations among neighbors, and social media buzzed with live updates under hashtags like #WetlandWarrior and #CedarGroveRevolt. During recess, I received messages of support from unexpected sources. Neighbors who had long been frustrated by the HOA's arbitrary fines, environmental activists, and even some board members who admitted that the HOA's approach was too draconian. These messages fortified my resolve, and I returned to the stand with renewed determination. The second half of the hearing was a whirlwind of cross-examinations and legal arguments. Karen's attorney pressed me on technical details, trying to sow doubt about the legitimacy of my declaration. But every challenge was met with clear, concise responses backed by documentation. I explained that the trench on my property, which some had claimed was altered illegally, was actually part of a planned environmental restoration project designed to improve water flow and enhance the natural habitat. I pointed to aerial photographs and time-stamped records that confirmed the work had been done in compliance with state laws. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding as I laid out the facts. The turning point came when an environmental expert took the stand, a respected local biologist who testified about the benefits of wetlands in mitigating flood risks and supporting wildlife. Her testimony was a bombshell. She explained in plain language how my wetlands were not only legal but beneficial, and that preserving them was in the best interest of the entire community. As the testimony concluded, the courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs of approval. It was clear that the tide was turning. The judge then asked a pointed question. Given the evidence and expert testimony, can it truly be argued that the alterations to this property were illegal? The question hung in the air like a gavel strike, and in that moment, the truth was undeniable. My wetlands were a legally protected feature, and any attempt to fine me for their existence was baseless. The final moments of the hearing were a blur of decisive statements. The judge declared that the HOA's fine was to be rescinded immediately and ordered a full review of the HOA's policies regarding private property modifications. The ruling sent shockwaves through Cedar Grove. Karen's face, once brimming with self-assurance, fell as she realized that her rigid enforcement had been dismantled by the very evidence she had hoped to ignore. The decisive moment came on a crisp morning in the packed courtroom of Cedar Grove's local courthouse. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as counsel Judge Eleanor Watts, a seasoned jurist known for her fair-mindedness, leaned forward and addressed the assembly. After reviewing the comprehensive digital evidence, expert testimonies, and legal documentation provided, it is my judgment that the wetland declaration presented by the defendant is lawful and serves a critical environmental purpose. The alterations in question were part of a long-planned, approved environmental restoration project, she declared. Her words reverberated across the courtroom. I stood tall, my heart pounding with relief and vindication. Karen Miller's attorney tried frantically to object, arguing that such a ruling would set a dangerous precedent for the HOA's authority. But Judge Watts was resolute. The evidence is irrefutable, she stated firmly. Private property rights and environmental protection cannot be sacrificed for the sake of maintaining a superficial aesthetic. The defendants' actions were not only legal. They are commendable in the context of environmental stewardship. At that moment, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and relieved murmurs from those who had long suffered under arbitrary fines. The final blow came when a senior environmental consultant took the stand and corroborated every point in my testimony, explaining in clear, accessible language how wetlands mitigate flood risks and enhance biodiversity. The judge's subsequent ruling, that all fines imposed in relation to the disputed property modifications were null and void, was a resounding victory not only for me, but for every resident who cherished the freedom to shape their property as they saw fit. As the hearing concluded, the judge's final words echoed. Let this decision serve as a reminder that our community must value progress, creativity, and a natural world. No one's rights shall be curtailed by outdated notions of order. In that defining moment, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. My wetland declaration had not only defended my property rights, it had sparked a broader re-examination of the HOA's policies, paving the way for future reform. In the weeks following the ruling, Cedar Grove underwent a remarkable transformation. News of the judge's decision spread like wildfire through local media and social networks, igniting a wave of support and calls for reform. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Era for Cedar Grove" and "Property Rights and Environmental Stewardship Triumph," celebrated the landmark decision. Hashtags like #WetlandVictory, #PropertyRights, and #Cedar Grove Reform trended widely, reinforcing the community's commitment to protecting individual freedoms and the environment. Town hall meetings and community forums were filled to capacity as residents gathered to share their relief and to discuss the broader implications of the ruling. Neighbors, who had long lived in fear of arbitrary HOA fines, now spoke openly about the importance of embracing progressive, environmentally friendly practices. Our community is not a museum of sameness, one resident declared passionately at a crowded meeting. We must learn to value diversity in our landscapes, and that means respecting private property rights as well as the natural world. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, initiated comprehensive reviews of all HOA policies. New guidelines were introduced that not only protected homeowners' rights to modify their property, but also encouraged sustainable practices. Our duty is to foster a community where innovation and environmental stewardship go hand in hand, Lieutenant Reed stated during a follow-up press conference, his words resonating with the collective spirit of renewal. Local environmental groups and civil rights organizations also mobilized, holding workshops and public forums to educate residents on their rights and the importance of sustainable land management. These initiatives further strengthened the community's resolve, and digital petitions calling for even broader reforms quickly amassed thousands of signatures. The overwhelming public support reaffirmed that the fight was not just for my property, it was for the future of Cedar Grove itself. For me, the journey from confrontation in court to this moment of community transformation was deeply personal and profoundly uplifting. My wetland declaration, once a target of the HOA's arbitrary fines, had become a symbol of progress, a testament to the idea that true order comes from a balance between individual freedom and responsible stewardship of nature. Neighbors who had long felt suppressed by rigid rules now found their voices, sharing stories of their own battles and celebrating the victory of creativity over conformity. At a final celebratory event held in the community park, residents, local officials and environmental advocates gathered beneath the golden light of a setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Sustainable Progress," was unfurled between majestic oak trees, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter future. Today, we celebrate not just a legal victory, but the power of community to stand together for what is right. Council Judge Watts's words were recalled as an emblem of that day's triumph. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protecting both our property rights and the natural beauty that defines our home. As each new day dawned over Cedar Grove, the legacy of that fateful courtroom battle endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how my wetland declaration, a symbol of environmental wisdom, gave the HOA the ultimate headache became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in innovation and individual rights. Every sunrise now carried the promise that in Cedar Grove, truth, justice, and a respect for nature would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal confrontation evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of arbitrary interference. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Grove would forever be a place where creativity, environmental stewardship, and a freedom to live authentically were cherished above all else.